in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, he took that which was formless and void, and he fashioned it, and he formed it, and he filled it. The first thing that God did was he separated the light from the dark, then the day from the night, the land from the sea, the sky from the land. He put animals on the earth, and birds in the air, and fish in the sea. And when he was done creating, he looked out and he said, "It is good. Let's make man in our image," he said. So God then took from the dust of the earth, and he began to fashion and form from the dust a man, and he breathed life. And the first man was called Adam. God placed Adam in the garden, and in the garden he said, "Go, work the garden, enjoy the garden." And Adam was able to walk in the garden and talk with God and walk with God and know God intimately in the garden. But when God looked at Adam, he thought, it's not good. He needs a helper. So he took Adam and he put Adam to sleep, and he took from Adam his rib. And from that rib, he began to fashion and form and made woman. And he called this woman Eve. So he took Adam and Eve and he placed them in the garden, and he said, "Be fruitful, multiply." And Adam and Eve were able to walk in the garden and enjoy each other and enjoy God and enjoy their time with God, intimately knowing everything they could about God. But God had told Adam, when you're in the garden, there's one tree. I have a rule for you that you should not partake of, and it is called the tree of good and evil. Because if you take of this tree, you will know of evil, and that would separate you from me. Well, as they were out in the garden one day, in the garden there was a creature that was more crafty than any other creature that was in the garden. And this creature was so crafty that one day, as Eve stood by the tree of knowledge, good and evil, he looked at her and he said, "Did God really say that you cannot take of the fruit?" He changed it just enough and put just enough doubt in Eve's mind that Eve reached up and she took of the fruit. And then she looked over at Adam and she handed it to him, and he took of the fruit. And as they ate the fruit, suddenly they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. God, about this time, was walking around in the garden. And as God was walking in the garden, he called out, "Adam, where are you?" And Adam cried out, "Over here, Lord, I'm hiding." God said, "Adam, why are you hiding? Did you take of the fruit?" And Adam said, "The woman you made for me gave it to me." And God said, "Eve, what have you done?" And Eve said, "The serpent you created gave it to me." Well, God loved Adam and Eve so much that he knew they could no longer stay in the garden. If Adam and Eve stayed in the garden, they could be separated from him forever, because they now knew about evil. And so he was also concerned because there was one tree in the garden that was a very special tree, and that tree was called the tree of life. And if Adam and Eve took of the tree of life, they would forever live in eternity separated from God. So God took Adam and Eve out of the garden, and he shut up the garden and placed guards before it so that they could never take of the tree of life, because he loved them so much. Adam and Eve went out into the world, and they did what God had said. Do you remember? God had told them, "Be fruitful and multiply," and they did. They were very fruitful and they multiplied, and they had 2 sons. And as their sons grew up, they too wanted to go and worship the God who had created their mother and father. Now Cain and Abel took their offerings. Abel took of his first fruits. But Cain, he took his in the process of time. Abel's was accepted. Cain's was not. And as God looked down upon the earth, he saw that Cain's countenance was downcast and upset. And God said, "Why are you so downcast?" He goes, "Don't you know that sin is crouching at your door, and you can master it?" Cain didn't listen to God. He chose to allow sin to master him, and he murdered his brother because he was jealous, because his brother's offering was accepted and his was not. And the process of sin introduced from that fruit in the garden began to make its way through mankind. And it only took 10 years. Only 10 years 10 generations is all it took. 10 generations for that wickedness to penetrate all of mankind in such a way that when God looked down on the earth, it was all wickedness. God was grieved that he had created man. But when he looked out, he saw that there was one man, and his name was Noah. And he saw that this man was righteous. So he went to Noah and he said, "Noah, I want you to build an ark because I am going to wipe out this earth. Man has become wicked and I'm done. I want you to get your family. I want you to take animals. I want you to take the animals 2 by 2 onto the ark. You'll have the clean. You'll have the unclean. I'm going to flood the earth. You're going to close up the ark. And you have to do this." And Noah did exactly as God said. He obeyed God. In every little detail that God gave him, he obeyed. And he built the ark. And he got the animals and he gathered his family and they went on the ark and the Lord shut the door and the earth flooded. And all of mankind, every creature was wiped out except for those that were on the ark. And they waited for a very long time on the ark as the floods covered the earth for the waters to recede. And when it was time for them to get off the ark, they had a little dove, a bird that came back with its little olive branch. They knew it was coming close to time. And then finally, when they were able to get out and walk on dry land, the Lord had placed a beautiful rainbow in the sky as a covenant promise that he would never flood the earth again. And Noah and his family went off the ark. And they did what God had asked Adam and Eve in the garden. And they went out, and they were fruitful, and they multiplied. And in fact, it was through his son Shem that a man named Abram was born. Now, God eventually names him Abraham, and that's who I'm going to call him Abraham. Now, Abraham was the one that God said, "I'm going to choose you and your lineage to be the people that will be a great nation like the stars in the universe or the sand by the sea." And he said, "Abraham, I want you to leave your land and I want you to go to the place that I tell you." And you know what? He did exactly what God asked him to do. And it was counted as righteousness unto him because he did it in obedience. He was married to a woman named Sarah. But in time, God named her Sarah. We'll call her Sarah from now on. Abraham and Sarah wanted to have a child. And they knew that God had promised that through them, that there would be a nation like the stars in the universe. But they waited. And waited. And waited. And waited. To the point that their bodies were old. There was no way they could ever have children now, Sarah thought. So she said to her husband Abraham, "You know what? God said he's going to give us a child. You're going to take my maid Hagar, and you're going to give me a child." Because in their culture, they would allow that. And so Abraham did what Sarah asked, and he took the maid Hagar, and sure enough, he had a son. His son's name was Ishmael. But see, God has a plan. And when God has a plan and God tells you what you must do, God said, "I'm going to give a child through Abraham and Sarah." God did not say, "I'm going to give a child through Abraham and Hagar." That was not God's plan. He was not to be the child that the promise of the lineage would come through. And they had to wait some more. And in the process of time, in the fullness of when God was ready for them to have a child, he filled Sarah's womb with the seed of Abraham. And she had a son. Oh, the laughter, the joy. God keeps his promises, she declared, because he has given me a child. And they named him Isaac. Isaac was so precious to them because he was the one that the promise would come through. And Isaac grew up and he had sons. Isaac had twins, actually, Esau and Jacob. Now, Esau, he was red and broody and he was kind of outdoorsy and he kind of really loved to do the hunting. Whereas Jacob was more refined and really preferred more the studies and the indoors. Jacob and Esau battled with each other as twins all through their life growing up. There was a struggle between them. Because see, Esau was the firstborn. Jacob was the secondborn. And you would think, based on the fact that Esau was firstborn, that Esau would be the one that the promise would come through. But God had a plan. And it was not Esau. It was to be through Jacob. In fact, when Jacob was older and he was coming back to meet his brother one night while he was on the Jabbok River, the angel of the Lord came and he wrestled and he struggled all night with the angel of the Lord, and he would not let go of the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord is like, let go of me. And he said, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And the angel of the Lord blessed him. And Jacob's name actually changed that night to Israel. And as his name changed and in the struggle that he had, he ended up being known to all the people as the man who struggled with man and God, and he overcame. But as that struggle occurred, he wrenched his hip, and he kind of walked with a limp after that. And that limp was so pronounced that the nation of Israel, they actually changed their diet. And from that point forward to this day, they will not eat of the hip of an animal. It's amazing when God has a plan and the things that people will do to follow his plan. So as Jacob grew in Israel, he became Israel, he too had sons. But he married 2 wives. He had 2 wives. One was Leah and one was Rachel. Amongst these 2 wives, Leah was blessed with 10 sons. But his favorite wife, Rachel, only 2. And he really loved the son of his wife, Rachel. In fact, his love for her son was so pronounced that the 10 sons of Leah were very jealous of their brother, Joseph. In fact, they were so jealous that one day when they were out working and way out in the desert, they took him and they plotted and they planned and they sold their own brother as a slave. They sold him off in a caravan to go into Egypt. Who knows what would happen to him? They didn't care because they were done with the one that they were jealous of. That wickedness just kept penetrating inside man. They actually took his coat and they shredded it and they dipped it in animal blood. And they went back to their father and said, he is dead. And he grieved for his son. He grieved over his son. But see, God has a plan. And God, when he has a plan, God keeps his promises. And God had favor on Joseph. So as he went into Egypt as a slave, God ended up raising him up to be the second-hand man to Pharaoh. There was nothing that Pharaoh would not allow him to do. He could do anything as far as Pharaoh was concerned. And in the process, he was having some dreams, Pharaoh was, and he interpreted them for him. Because there was a great famine that was going to come in the land. And when this famine came, they weren't going to have enough food. But he had an idea because he was favored by God and God gave him wisdom and he told Pharaoh what to do. Ended up, his family needed food and they had to travel because they had heard that there was grain in Egypt. The first time his brothers came, he didn't let them know because at this point he looked more Egyptian than he looked Israel. And so he didn't let them know. And He just didn't. The second time they came, he couldn't bear it. He broke down and he cried. And he said, "Oh, brothers, I am your brother. What you intended for evil, God meant for good. Go back and get our father. Bring our family here so that you may live." And at this point, the brothers went back and they got their father, and he came with the entire nation of Israel. And at this point, 75 people. And all of them moved into the land of Goshen and lived in Egypt. And as they lived in the land of Goshen, they obeyed God's command to Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply. And they were. And in the process of time, 400 years passed where they lived in the land of Egypt, to the point that a Pharaoh was raised up that knew nothing of Joseph, nothing of his relationship with the previous Pharaoh. All he knew was that when he looked at those Israelites, they were a problem. They were a serious problem because they were fruitful and they were multiplying, and he was afraid they were going to take over the land. They were everywhere. So he made an edict to have their firstborns disposed of, have them killed. But there was a family that couldn't bear to do that. And God had a plan. God had a plan. And he chose, because the nation began to cry out. The nation began to realize how the bondage they were in was so heavy. They were a nation that began from a lineage of knowing what it was like to walk and be in the presence of God. And through the wickedness of sin, they lost that privilege. They began to cry out, "Oh God, oh God, oh God, deliver us." And God heard their cry. And he protected one little boy that he appointed to be the ruler and judge that would be their deliverer. And this mom and dad kept him quiet and hidden until it was impossible to hide him anymore. So they had to take him, and they took a basket, and they covered it with tar, pitch. And they went out and they put him in the river and let him float down the river. Because God has a plan. Guess who should be the one to draw him out of the river? But Pharaoh's own daughter. And as she drew him out, she says, "I will call him Moses, because I drew him out of the water." And she raised him as her own son. An Israelite baby that Pharaoh had said, "Kill them all," now is being raised in his own court as his own lineage. But he needed to be nursed and fed. God would have it. There was a woman that could take care of it. His mom raised him to know about being an Israelite. And as he grew up, knowing everything he could know, being educated as an Egyptian, he also understood the lineage of being an Israelite. And one day when he was 40-something years old, he was walking out to look out amongst his people to see how they were doing. And there were two men fighting. And as these two men were fighting, he went up to put a stop to it. And as he went to stop them, he killed one. He tried to hide it. He buried him in the sand. The next morning when he woke up, he went out to go out amongst the people. And two of the Israelites were fighting amongst themselves. And he went out and he goes, "Come on, brothers. You don't need to be fighting." And one of them like, "Who made you ruler and judge? You going to kill me like you did the guy yesterday?" When he heard that, he knew he could not stay. He took flight and he ran all the way to Midian. And in Midian, he ended up marrying and having his own children in the land of Midian and becoming a shepherd. And for 40 years, he watched over the flocks in the fields. And one day, as he was out in the fields watching over the flocks, he looked up and he thought, "What is that? That bush is burning, but it's not consumed." He thought, "This is a strange thing. I'm going to go over and see what is going on." And as he walked closer, he heard the voice of God say, "Moses, take off your shoes. You are standing on holy ground." God told him, "I have heard the cries of my people, and I'm going to send you to deliver them so that they can come and worship me." Lord, who do I say is sending me? "You will tell them that I am has sent you." That is the name I want to be remembered for all generations. I'm not so good with talking. Who gave you your mouth, Moses? I will give you the words that you need to speak. Moses did exactly what God told him to do and obeyed him in every detail and gathered up and went back to Egypt. The same man that a man said, who made you ruler and judge. Walking back into the land of Egypt as he went in, God gave him miraculous events that would totally reveal to all of Egypt, all of Israel, and anyone else who is there that is observing that Moses is working for holy God and that God has sent him to deliver. And so he began a process of sending plagues upon the nation of Egypt. And with each progressive plague, Moses would go and ask Pharaoh to release them so that they could go worship their God. And Pharaoh's heart every time would get harder and harder. Moses finally, when the last plague was happening, went in. Because the last plague was the same thing that Pharaoh had wanted to do to the Egyptians, the killing of their children. It was the death of the firstborn sons. And Pharaoh's own son died. And he says, go, Moses, go. Go and take your people, go worship your God. Take them and leave. Moses got up and he went out and he got the nation of Israel together. And as the nation was gathering together, the most amazing thing happened. The Egyptians were running out with their silver and gold, giving it to them. So not only did God free them, but he gave them provision for what he was about to do in taking them into the promised land. And they began their journey. And as they got up to the Red Sea, they were about to, looking and they're thinking, how are we going to cross? They see suddenly that Pharaoh realized what he had done. That he had released the ones that were taking care of the nation. So he sent his army after them. And they're thinking, we're going to die right here. Moses lifted up his staff and God separated the Red Sea, and the entire nation of Israel crossed over on dry land. Not one of them injured. The moment their feet got to the other side, the Egyptian army began to cross, and the waters fell in and wiped out the entire army of Pharaoh. The nation of Israel began to sing and dance and shout and celebrate. Our God is a deliverer. And it was by the blast of his nostrils. He parted the sea that we crossed on dry land. And he wiped out Pharaoh's army. Gone forever. And they began their journey in the wilderness, walking to go to the promised land. And on the third day, the nation of Israel looked at Moses and said, Moses, why did you tell us to do this? They began to grumble and complain. We don't have anything to eat. We don't have anything to drink. They began to whine. They began, oh, Moses, blah, 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 blah. We've been better off back in Egypt making those bricks, Moses. 3 days they had already forgotten what God had done for them. And God looked at the nation and he said, not happening. This nation, every single one of you that's grumbling and complaining will not go into the promised land. I will raise up a new generation, and that generation will be, and it took 40 years for all of those that grumbled and complained to pass away. And finally, when the new generation was raised up, a generation that knew the blessing of God being present. Because see, what God did is he provided this pillar of cloud by day to guide them, and a great big fire by night to set them in their direction. He provided what they needed. He sent manna on the earth for them to eat. And he sent quail from the sky for them to have meat. Their shoes never wore out. Their coats never wore out. They knew what it was like to have God present with them. And all this time, there was a man walking behind Moses that was a faithful servant and follower. Because see, a good leader is always a good follower. And God appointed Joshua to be the one to lead them into the promised land. And it was finally time where Moses said, Joshua, you will lead them. Joshua gets them ready and he takes them into the promised land. They're about to go in and take over Jericho. And as they are going in, there were certain rules that God had. Just as he had a rule in the garden. Because God cares about the first fruits, he said, you will not take anything from Jericho. All of Jericho is mine. And they went into the land of Jericho. And they did exactly in detail, with obedience to what God said, marching around the city and watching the walls come tumbling down in the most miraculous way, with a shout and a trumpet blow. It's amazing how God works out his plan. But there was one man, he noticed that they had these little idols that man had taken, wood, bronze, rock, and fashioned and formed so that they could worship it. And he thought, you know, I see that. I want it. I'm going to take it. He did. Well, all of a sudden, every victory they went to go fight from that point forward, they couldn't win. They were losing every single battle. And they began to seek God and ask God, what is wrong? And God said, I want you to bring the nation, tribe by tribe, to me. All 12 tribes, bring them and I will reveal to you. And they finally get to, and Joshua is standing before the man Achan. And he says, Achan, what have you done? And he said, I saw it, I wanted it, and I took it. And on that day, the entire family of Achan was put to death because they disobeyed God. And unfortunately, as the nation of Israel began to go in and conquer the land, they would look out in the land of Babylon and they would see these idols that they had, and they would want these idols. And they began this process of, whoa, I see what they have, and taking it. And as they would take their idols in and begin to worship the things that they did, instead of worshiping holy creator God, the creator of heaven and earth, they began to put their mind on the things of Babylon. And the process began this spiral of sin that would take them down. As they would go further into sin, they would get in bondage so deep that they would begin to cry out to God, oh God, deliver us, deliver us. And God would send a deliverer, and they would come in the form of judges. And there were many great judges. There was Deborah and Gideon and Samson. And with each judge, they would get delivered out of their bondage. But they would move up just a little bit, and somehow they just kept going more wicked. And so they never quite got back to where they were worshiping holy God. And then they began to look out at the other nations, and they saw that the other nations had kings. Well, they've got a king. We want a king. Give us a king. And they actually had the audacity to demand of God a king. They demanded that God would give them a king. And God said through the prophets, you do not want a king. A king is going to take your people. A king's going to take your wives. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your husbands and make him labor. He's going to take your fields, your tithes, your offerings. You do not want a king. And they said, give us a king. So God gave them a king. And they got a king all right, but it wasn't a very godly king. In fact, Saul, the first king, was selfish, self-centered. He was not a wise man. So God appointed a man to become the king. A man that through his lineage, that he would raise up so that the Messiah, the true deliverer, would come. And that young man's name was David, a little shepherd boy. A man that could play the harp and sing poetry and worship God, but at the same time he was a warrior, and he could fight, and he could do battles, and he could slay and conquer and have victory for God. And David grew and became the king. But as a king, he had temptation placed before him. And as the temptation was there, he sinned. He sinned a grievous sin. He had an adulterous affair. He murdered a man. And one day the prophet came to him. David thought he had it all hidden. He's the king after all. No one knows. And the prophet Nathan came to him and told him a story about a man who stole another man's one lone sheep. And David said, kill him. And the prophet said, it's you. When David heard and realized that he had sinned before God, he repented of his sin. He cried out and asked God, forgive me, O God. And he asked God to restore him in such a way that he would then in turn be able to lead others to God. That is what made David a man after God's own heart. And that is why he's the one that was chosen to be the king, where the lineage would come through. Well, as the nation began to progress and move forward, they went after their kings. They went further and further into Babylon. And eventually, through his son Solomon, King David's son Solomon, the nation of Israel split. You had the 10 tribes of Leah's sons here and the 2 tribes of Rachel over here, Israel and Judah. All 10 kings through all the kings through her 10 sons, all generations were wicked. But through Rachel's sons, every once in a while they would have a good king. Every once in a while. And God said, you know what? You want Babylon? I'm going to give you Babylon. And Babylon consumed the nation of Israel. Israel was so prideful, so focused on themselves, and the nation of Babylon was so prideful and so focused on themselves that God said, okay, you need to learn another lesson. Persia is going to take over Babylon. And so Israel was consumed inside Babylon, consumed inside Persia, because they had a very important lesson they needed to learn. See, as a nation, corporately, if they sinned, it didn't matter if there was one who was righteous. God had to discipline the nation. And that's what he did. And as they went through that process of growth and that time, they ended up having a man that was so against the nation of Israel that he wanted to annihilate all of them. But God has a plan and God has a purpose. He says, I am not going to let that happen. I made a promise that I would bring Abraham's lineage like the stars in the universe. I made a promise that I'm going to send the Messiah, the deliverer. And so he raised up a little maiden girl, a Jewish maiden girl, to become the queen of Persia. She was the one that he used to deliver the entire nation. A young Jewish maiden. About 40 years after she reigned as queen, there was a cupbearer that was very sad before his king. And if you know anything about cupbearers, you don't go sad before the king. And the king says, what is wrong? And he said, I've heard that my land is in devastation, and I need to go back. And he said, oh, you must go. And that king not only said, you must go back to restore the broken down walls of your people, I'll give you everything that you need to go back. And so he went back, Nehemiah, to restore the land and restore the walls of his people, with this king providing everything, the king of Persia providing everything for the nation of Israel to be restored. And then he did it within 49 days. It was the most miraculous, amazing miracle, because they had a sword in one hand and they had a hammer in the other. They worked all day and they had to have a sword to fight at night. And then the nation settled in and a strange thing happened. God went silent. No prophet, no teacher, no word, no message, silence. And the nation of Israel began to realize they messed up. See, they're a nation that knew what it was to walk with God. They knew what it was like to have his light in the day. They knew what it was like to have his light at night. They knew what it was like to be fed by God. They knew what it was like to have their clothes completely taken care of by God. And they had taken him for granted. And they began to cry out, oh God, oh God, oh God, deliver us, God. Please send us the Messiah. Send us the one that you have promised that you would send. God, we cry out to you. Send us the deliverer. And in the process of time, when God had appointed for his son to come to this earth, a host of angels appeared in the sky above, where shepherds were down below watching over their sheep. And they said, glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill towards man. Unto you this day in the city of David a Savior is born, Christ the child. You will find him lying in a manger. The shepherds could not go and see. They got up and immediately went to go check it out. And sure enough, lying in the manger, born to a virgin, wrapped in swaddling clothes, rested Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus, the Messiah, deliverer. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature in favor with God and man. And as he began the process of growing up, it was time for him to take over his ministry. He went out into the desert, and there came that crafty serpent again. And before Christ, he placed temptation. The temptation of prestige, pride, power. And every time the temptation came to him, Jesus spoke God's word in truth, and the temptation was stopped. He came out of that desert completely sinless. And as he walked out, he began to look at men, and he'd say, "You, come, follow me. You, come, follow me. You, come." It didn't matter what they were doing, whether they were fishermen or tax collectors. They dropped everything and they left it behind. And they began to walk with Jesus. And as they walked with him, he began to speak, to teach, to preach, to heal. And all of a sudden, the blind could see, the lame could walk, the mute could speak, the deaf could hear. But as the disciples were walking and listening to him, something amazing began to happen. They were thinking, you know, those things are amazing, but I'm not the same person I was. Since I've been walking with Christ, I am changed. He's changed me. There's something amazing about him. And as he began to follow them, there were some men that were watching, and all they could think is, how dare he take our power? How dare he think he has authority? Who gave him that authority? And they began to plot. They began to plan, and they purposed to kill him. And as Jesus was walking with the disciples, he knew that the time was coming when these men were going to succeed at what God had planned for them to do. Because God had a plan, and his plan was to send a deliverer through his son. And Jesus took his disciples and he said, okay, this is what you need to do. I'm going to send you out 2 by 2. And I want you to go and be a witness, and I want you to tell people what you have seen and heard. And they went out, and they did exactly as Christ told them in obedience. And as they walked out in obedience to what Christ said, the most amazing thing happened. They saw the blind could see, the lame could walk, the mute could speak, the deaf could hear. Lives were changed. But an amazing thing happened. They saw Satan fall like lightning from the sky. They ran back to Jesus, and they said, you are never going to believe this. We saw Satan fall like lightning. And Jesus said, do not celebrate that. What I want you to celebrate, I want you to celebrate that your name is in the Lamb's book of life. And he began to continue his ministry. And finally, at the appointed time, it was time for him to do what God sent him to do. The evil men and man, Judas, succeeded. And with a kiss and 30 shekels, they sold an innocent man, holy God, to die on a cross. They pierced him. They spat on him. They rejected him. They took his hands and they nailed him and his feet to a cross to die a criminal's death. And he did it in obedience to the Father. Not my will, your will, God, be done. And he died. But on the third day, he rose from that grave. And he walked on this earth for 40 days. People saw him. They spoke to him. They sat with him. They talked with him. They ate with him. They dialogued, and he continued the teaching. And finally, on the 40th day, on the Mount of Olives, he looked out at the disciples and he said, I want you to go to Jerusalem and wait for the Holy Spirit to come upon you. I want you to wait for the Holy Spirit to come, because I want you to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the outermost parts of this earth. And the disciples did exactly as he said. And after 10 days, the Holy Spirit came and he fell upon them. And as he fell upon them, they began to speak in languages for every nation that was represented there. And they began to share what they had seen and what they had heard. And they were faithful to follow through in obedience to what he had commanded them to do. Now, there was one man that didn't like it. because he could see the power and authority that was in them. And he wanted to put a stop to it. His name was Saul. And he had papers to go and destroy what was going on in Damascus. And as he was beating that road to Damascus to stop the people of the way that were telling of what Jesus did, suddenly a light appeared in the sky. And he fell down. And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And he said, "I am Jesus, the one that you were persecuting. I want you to go to the street called Straight. And I want you to wait for the man named Ananias, and he will come and tell you what you must do." They got him up and he couldn't see. They guided Saul to that street. And for 3 days he fasted and prayed in a closet, waiting for Ananias. When Ananias showed up, he put his hands on him and began to pray. And as he was praying, it was as scales fell from his eyes. And suddenly he understood. He went out and he was baptized, and he began to preach and teach and heal, just like Jesus, as he had asked the disciples to do. And it is through him we have 13 letters in our New Testament. There was one disciple that didn't die a true martyr's death, and that he did not die a martyr's death the way all the others did. They had tried to kill him. They threw him in a vat of oil, but it didn't kill him. So they took him and they put him on the island of Patmos. And it was there that John received a revelation that Jesus is coming again. And he saw a revelation of heaven where there are no tears, no sorrow, no pain, but just the glory of the Lord and his presence with his people there honoring him and worshiping him. That isn't where the story ends. Today, I'm going to walk you through that you are called out. You are here because God wanted you here. You have been appointed because God has a plan for you. And it is for you to go and be his witness to your Jerusalem, your Judea, your Samaria, to the outermost parts of this world. So you need to come back so we can talk about what does it mean to be light, and how can I shine so that I reveal the glory of the Lord. Thank you.